Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society, and I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. The climate crisis cannot be solved by one person, one organization, one company, or one government. A network of collaboration is being built, and nonprofits often serve as the connective tissue. Our guest today is Brett Jenks, CEO of RARE, a global conservation and development organization dedicated to empowering communities in the world's most biologically diverse regions to sustainably manage their natural resources. Under Brett's leadership, RARE has grown from a small nonprofit into a global leader in conservation, with a $30 million annual budget and active projects across 60 countries. RARE's efforts span a variety of critical areas, including Fish Forever, the world's largest coastal fishery recovery effort, Lands for Life, a climate-smart agriculture program, and the groundbreaking Center for Behavior and the Environment, which merges behavioral science with conservation, and Climate Culture, a strategy designed to help the U.S. meet its Paris Agreement targets. Brett is also an innovator for the for-profit sector with the Malloy Fund, a blue economy investment vehicle that supports a growing portfolio of companies, including several focused on sustainable fisheries in Southeast Asia, and Everforest, a video game that turns virtual actions into real-world tree planting. You can learn more about RARE at rare.org and about the Malloy Fund at malloyfund.com. Malloy is spelled with one L and no dash, no space, malloyfund.com. There's a lot to cover in Brett's decades of work, and we'll begin the conversation right after this quick commercial break. Welcome to the show, Brett. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Mitch.
Well, thank you for joining us. RARE is doing so many different things, but I wanted to start off by asking you, in the face of a comprehensive challenge like climate change, how do you decide where to deploy resources?
Wherever we can make the biggest difference. And for us, traditionally, that has been in the global south, where the world's poorest people live in the world's richest places, where they have a disproportionate influence on nature outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to save the coral reefs, other than addressing climate change, you have to address overfishing in coastal communities. If you want to feed the world's poorest people living in coastline along the coasts, you have to make sure that you can restore the fisheries. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to work with the coastal fishing communities themselves. You say the same thing for farming and regenerative agriculture. The world's poorest farmers living in the world's highest biodiversity countries. So that's why we work in places like Indonesia and the Philippines and Mozambique and Colombia. Lots of biodiversity, lots of vulnerable people who really have not just a stake,
Mm-hmm.
but a say over how those resources are managed.
Well, and I think we haven't recognized that there is an opportunity for them to be connected to the preservation of the entire planet, but we have to respect the value of what they contribute more than we ever have before. How do you convey that urgency to investors or backers of RARE when you're explaining what you want to do with their money?
So I think the urgency is a really good question. I think you can look at it a couple of different ways. Partly it's for the particular audience, for a particular donor, it's what are their values? So
Mm-hmm.
do they value nature as a sacred place to observe, to scuba dive in, to walk through, to go on safari around? Is it the species themselves? Is it the elephants or the giraffes or the Napoleon wrasse swimming on a reef? Sometimes it's the humanity, it's the altruism that wanting to help your fellow human being um, do a little better,
Mm-hmm.
in the coming season. And so, but I think ultimately urgency, how do you make the case for urgency? I think it requires a multifaceted approach. The way I think about it today, speaking to myself, for
Mm-hmm.
myself, is we are facing the greatest crisis humanity's ever faced, and it's coming on many fronts.
Mm-hmm.
We are probably not mature enough as a civilization to manage AI. We can barely manage social media. I'm not even sure we're doing that. Um, Will we be able to manage the transition to robotic manufacturing? What about biotechnology and genetic engineering? Are humans actually going to be smart enough and mature enough and wise enough to manage our own genetic evolution? I doubt it. I'm skeptical, but I'm also hopeful about some of the problems we can solve with those technologies. But in the work that Rare does, there's really three big ones, three
Mhm.
big reasons to treat these issues with urgency. And one is the loss of nature. The only reasons human beings exist, the only reason you and I are here is because we have had about 10,000 solid years on this 5 billion year old rock of a stable climate. The Holocene has enabled us to raise crops, to feed ourselves, to store them, to develop art and culture and language, the kinds of things that would be impossible if we were living on just pick your planet. There's no way we can inhabit any of the ones you could name because there's not a climate that's inhabitable. We were born here. So one, if we lose nature, it's beyond existential if there's such a thing. Second, climate change, I have a friend who wrote a book called Earth in Human Hands, and he's the chief astrobiologist for NASA. He knows a lot about life on other planets. That's his job. Life on this planet has requires not only that stable climate, but it requires that human beings learn how to inhabit this planet because we are now in a position of geoengineering with our daily lifestyles.
That's the nut of the problem right there, is that we are in the midst of continuing to change the planet, even though we recognize that many of the changes that we've wrought so far have been disastrous. What's the right way to think about a question like, should we bioengineer a crop? Is it principally the application of the precautionary principle that we need to begin to practice instead of simply diving into the future unburdened?
I think first principle for me is let's not kid ourselves to think that we get to decide.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many people out there, so many competing forces, so many open markets, so many different kinds of governance because of the different kinds of governments around the world. I don't get to pick,
Yeah,
but precautionary principle has to be thrown into the mix. I think the potential, the techno optimism that comes from our ability potentially to solve some new diseases or to rid ourselves of current plagues and or famines. There are good reasons to explore some of these things, but ultimately, how do you prioritize what to invest in? I think it's sort of it goes back to sort of in my mind, the hedgehog principle. Where can we make a difference? Where can we meaningfully endeavor to make beneficial change? What do we have the resources and the talent to do? And do we have the privilege and the opportunity to give it a shot? Going back to my earlier point, I just want to finish that thought. So you have loss of nature, you have
hmm,
climate change, and then you have over the next 20 to 50 years climate migration. That is
hmm.
actually the one that is the result of losing nature, the result of climate change will be vast expanses of uninhabitable parts of the planet. What happens when 200 to 500 million people need to relocate? We are on the verge of leaning towards what I would call a right-wing tyranny of xenophobia, potentially, just to overplay it a little bit, in this upcoming election as a result of xenophobia that comes from a couple of million people crossing a border. Imagine 500 million climate migrants and what that would do to democracy in Europe, what it would do to democracy in North America. And so, if we don't address climate change, if we don't address the loss of nature, which is one of the great counterbalances to this climate change, we are so royally screwed that I don't think any of us can even articulate how bad it could get.
Truer words have seldom been spoken. Thank you. Let me ask about a few of the things you're doing to actually try to address this. So let's start with Fish Forever. It's a community-led fishery management program aimed at restoring coastal regions. Tell us about how's it going?
Actually, it's going really well. It was a slog. It was really hard to get going. 12 years ago, we couldn't get anybody to fund it. no one would take us seriously. That one, it's a tragedy of the commons that we're addressing. You have 50 million depending on how you count, 30 to 50 million coastal fishers. These are folks in dugout canoes, they're in small sailboats, they're in, I would call them the micro jalopies of the coastal waters
Hmm.
with a teeny tiny little sewing, engine basically on the back of what's essentially a panga or a dugout. And the teeming masses go out every day to race to catch the last fish. Not blaming overfishing on the world's poorest coastal fishers,
Sure.
because unbeknownst to them, given population growth, given scarcity of resources elsewhere, we've seen a precipitous 60-year decline in fish stocks and fish populations and biomass on reefs, in mangroves, in the seagrass beds. And those 30 to 50 million fishers feed about 1 billion people
Yeah.
every day, their number one supply of animal protein. Ideally, sustainable, renewable animal protein, because it's coming out of the sea, wild caught fisheries. So, one, nobody thought you could, address the tragedy of the commons because there were just so many people that you would have to regulate and manage, and none of the governments where we are operating, where the greatest marine biodiversity is and where the teeming masses of these coastal fishers are, none of the governments even have the resources to regulate or monitor or enforce rules and regulations if they were there. So basically, you've had vast, expansive overfishing. Question was, what's the solution?
Hmm.
So we asked ourselves, well, what if we sort of flipped the script? What if we empower, working with local mayors and local ministers, give the right to manage local fisheries to the local fishers themselves, so that they're not in a tragedy of the commons racing to catch the last fish, but they're sitting down together to say, well, what if we didn't fish over there where we know the nurseries are? And what if we didn't net the mangroves during the proverbial breeding season? And what if
Right.
we left a few fields fallow, so to speak? Science, we could tell them, would show that you can rebound your own fish stocks. Turns out we're just getting data in, this month, that from a 10-year analysis of 27 sites among the hundreds and hundreds of places we've worked, because it's expensive to do all this monitoring. So we have a very limited set long-term data that shows, roughly 500% increase in biomass over 10 years. That is almost miraculous.
That's
5x
impressive.
biomass, which means more food, means more income. And I think most importantly, in the near term, it means greater confidence among the fishers, greater pride in their role as stewards of nature. And it's the kind of thing that gives all of us at Rare and all of our partners working on Fish Forever around the world hope that humans can come together and we can actually restore nature. We're doing it en masse right now. So that's sort of the Fish Forever story in 5 minutes or less.
Well, now in Colombia, you're working with local farmers through the Rare Lands for Life initiative. How do you give the farmers that kind of control of not just their fields, but the economic impact of everything that feeds the field's productivity?
Yeah, it's really tricky and it's very different, because in the case of coastal fisheries, nobody owns the ocean.
Right.
So they're all sharing a resource. And that theoretically makes it way harder to manage because humans are humans. We cooperate, we're also selfish. It's a double-edged sword. If you can assume you can get past the land tenure issue, which is challenging. Let's assume that the farmers that we're working with in Colombia, these are smallholder farmers, so generally they're going to be managing less than 10 acres or 5 hectares, depending on where you live and how you speak. Basically, if you're an American, it's acres. If you're anywhere else, it's hectares. So these are smallholders. They don't have a lot of land. In the case of Colombia, they've had a veritable civil war for 50 years.
Yeah.
So they've had no agricultural extension. Even when you sit down with the Minister of Agriculture, they've had several over the last few years, he or she will agree less than 15% of Colombian farmers, there's a million of them, have had any kind of agricultural extension. So literally, no one has helped them in 50 years, let's just say. What does that mean? The only advice they've been given is by traveling salesmen who are selling them herbicides and fertilizers.
Hmm.
So the way they think about managing their farm, they describe it this way. I was just there last week. They describe it this way as, you show up, you strap on to the 3 gallon, jug behind you with a little spray pump, and you walk around and anything that doesn't look right, you kill. And then you walk around, another week and everything that looks good, you spray with a different,
Yeah.
fertilizer. So you're either feeding it or you're killing it. And so imagine what would happen to the soil. Imagine what would happen to the pollinators. Imagine what would happen to the landscapes if the culture was a really well managed local farm is covered in pesticides, is covered in fertilizer, and anything that isn't the food you're going to eat is killed and sliced and then thrown away. And let me just give you an example of how bad that gets. So, what a good local farm looked like was basically dirt and a cacao tree, or dirt and a yucca shrub. Meanwhile, all of those crops grow in an ecosystem and they have evolved in an ecosystem and they actually interact with all the life around them. So you're denuding the soil, you're taking away all of the natural, life on this farm in the spirit of industrial agriculture practices that might have made sense for a monocrop with 1,000 acres, but certainly I've just destroyed, systematically a smallholder plot.
So would you describe Land for Life as a regenerative rural extension service?
Yeah, in short, I would say regenerative agriculture for smallholders based on the notion that we have to revitalize and dramatically improve rural agricultural extension so that it focuses not just on boosting yields, but on restoring soil, regrowing and rewilding and renaturing essentially the landscape on which the farmer lives, reducing toxins, boosting composting, saving tons of money, and in the process, instilling a sense of hope and pride in a farmer so that they can thrive where they were born rather than feeling like they're stuck on a barren landscape with the need to migrate.
And that I think is interesting as if you think about it, and even from the right wing perspective, the xenophobic perspective that you were describing earlier, if we were to extend what we have done here in the States, although we did it in an industrial fashion and we need to correct that, to the farmers and the smallholders all over the world, so that that rural extension service and all the assistance, particularly the information so they can make their own decisions, is available to them, we could prevent that migration, and it would be a lot less expensive and a lot less deadly to do so. Have you explored that message with American political leaders, particularly those on the right?
Not yet. This is still early days. Last week, I brought with me a guy who to Columbia, a guy who founded the Climate Migration Council, which is a really interesting new group. And I was privileged enough to join it. That includes a whole bunch of former heads of state, former head like Carlos Alvarado Quesada, the former president of Costa Rica, Ivan Duque, former head of Colombia, and a whole host of former heads of Homeland Security, the kinds of folks who spent a lot of time thinking about migration, forced displacement, and what can now be called climate migration. A group that can begin to look ahead and think about this. There are still questions about the evidence base for this. I mean, to me, it's logical. To you, I think you intuitively agree with me. I think we still need to build a stronger evidence base, and
Yep.
we need to take care with our language. We're not anti-migration. People have the right, I believe, as a
Sure.
citizen of Earth, to go where they can best feed their families, to go where they can thrive. We have to manage migration to take care of both the incumbents, if you will, and the newcomers.
Mhm.
But what a shame if every kid who's born in a particular area simply won't be able to live there because of what past generations have done to that landscape.
Exactly. And it's not a matter of preventing migration, it's enabling people to stay in place because they choose to. And
Exactly.
we are literally forcing them off the land and then blaming them for it.
Yeah, we are the ones exporting the chemicals. We are the ones profiting off of the denaturing of those soils that will then make those landscapes uninhabitable. Exactly.
We need to take a quick commercial break. We're going to continue this fascinating discussion in just a moment. And now let's return to the discussion with Brett Jenks. He's CEO of RARE, which is a globe-spanning conservation and development nonprofit, as well as the founder of the Malloy Fund, which invests in a wide range of environment restoring companies. Brett, another of the projects that you've launched is the Center for Behavior and Environment, which integrates behavioral science with conservation. How does this approach differ from the traditional ways that we talk about conservation strategy?
This is a really exciting initiative. And we've been at this for 5 years now, and it's finally coming into its own. We have been working on behavior change for 30 years. I think it's fair to say we would estimate we've probably measurably changed the behavior of tens of millions of people, mostly in the global south, mostly the fishers, the farmers, the folks living in these high biodiversity areas, and mostly to benefit themselves. This is not about asking people to sacrifice.
Yeah.
We're not asking poor people to sacrifice anything in order to, benefit landscapes that we appreciate. That's not our approach to conservation. But over the year, we suddenly realized about, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago that there had been a revolution in behavioral science, that all of a sudden psychologists were winning Nobel Prize for economics because they had debunked the myth of, that Homo sapiens were actually Homo economicus, and that we all, walk around every day with a little calculator or an abacus and we simply add up, well, should I go to the beach? I don't know. What's the economic utility of going to the beach? Should I buy this car or that car? Well, what's the net present value of the car purchase? We are so much more irrational than we think. Most often, we sort of do what our neighbors do. We do what our family members do. We do what our friends do. We dress alike, we drive alike, we build our homes alike, we talk alike, we have similar, how are there only two political parties? How are there only two views with our various perspectives? I like to joke, self-deprecatingly on behalf of our species, we are lemmings with thumbs. And that's probably a disservice to the lemmings.
I'm sure it is.
So once we realized that some of this irrationality was predictable, that that social norms, that emotional appeals, that social incentives might actually be missing from our toolkit in conservation. We asked ourselves, so what can we do about that? Like, what would it look like to build the next generation conservation toolkit, the next generation, development science toolkit? And so it's a new science, essentially, that is about emotional appeals, social incentives, choice architecture. That's the lingo. But ultimately, it's just about understanding human nature. What are the behavioral insights that let us be more effective when encouraging people to do the right thing for themselves long term and for the planet near term? And so if you'll notice, and your listeners will notice, next time you walk through an airport or a bookstore, that there's a whole host of books that have come out in the last 10 years, starting with 11 years ago, Nudge, Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler. Thaler won the Nobel Prize, he was one of those guys. Thinking Fast and Slow, which is sort of the mother of the movement, really, and that's Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, and you can go on. There's a whole host of them. So we started calling those folks, called Cass, called Richard Thaler, called Elka Weber at Princeton, and Eric Johnson, her husband, at Columbia, and so on and so forth. And they all responded by saying, "Of course I would help you. No one from the environment has ever asked."
That dialogue needs to happen, but this is the other side of that question. Do we need to combine the behavioral changes that we're enacting with infrastructure to support truly comprehensive transformation of the economy? And what would that look like?
Well, great question. Let's take the Inflation Reduction Act.
Mhm.
So for the first time in history, game-changing legislation, 390 billion that could be a trillion, depending on this next election, in incentives,
Yeah.
carrots for doing the right thing. But they didn't build a marketing budget into the Inflation Reduction Act. And so the White House is left with all these great policies, but no marketing budget like you would have had for Obamacare or like you would have had for, for vaccinations during, COVID, to be able to get the word out that A, this money's available, B, these technologies can save you a lot of money over time, the EV, the heat pump, the solar panel, you name it. And so there's a big question about demand. So the combination of there's no great technology that just gets adopted on its own. It gets adopted in part because of a series of behavioral phenomena that make it credible, where there's social proof, that make it normative, where there's social pressure, where it's designed with the user in mind so that it's easy. It's marketed so that it's ever present. If you can make it easy, if you can make it observable, if you can make it socially acceptable, things can get adopted much more quickly and much more readily.
You've also started a fund, the Malloy Fund, to invest in companies, and particularly you've done sustainable fisheries in Asia, as I understand it. So how did the fund produce both that appreciation and value and the environmental benefits? And how do you communicate that to a potential investor?
We communicate the value proposition of an impact investment fund like the Malloy Fund by talking about multiple bottom lines. So
Mm-hmm.
one, you're going to invest, we're going to give you back more money than you invested. Two, the coastal fishery that we're investing that money in will be better off. Three, the people who fish those waters will be better off. So imagine, and often the most powerful way to communicate is just by telling a story. So here's a story, a real live case. There's a wily woman in Indonesia who has a fish processing plant. She, 6 years ago, doesn't really have any kind of bookkeeping. There's no standards over the octopus that she wants to harvest. She doesn't have any international agreements for export, and she couldn't meet the quality standards if she wanted to. And she has very low operating capital and no money to invest. She's, living day to day. And there's hundreds of, maybe I'll make up a number here, 400 local octopus farmers who are, well, gleaners, let's call them. They're not really farming, but they're gleaning, taking octopus out of the ocean, who depend on her because she's their buyer. So along comes the Malloy Fund, and we use a little bit of technical assistance, a little bit of grant money. We help her establish her bookkeeping process. That lets us see what the cash flows look like. Once there are cash flows, we can predict the degree to which putting a couple $100,000 in a loan to her at 15%, up to $1 million, that would let her get certified to export, that would let her set up some standards for the kind of octopus she's going to be buying in the future, that would let her have a couple of workshops with some scientists with her 400, gleaners, the octopus fishers. And so all of a sudden we understand the cash flows. Her company becomes an investable proposition. We make a loan, we get a 15% return on the loan. We provide a little, European agency might have given us some grant money to provide technical assistance. That doesn't have to be mixed in with the investment. So
Right.
someone's willing to take 100% loss on the grant, while other impact investors are going to get back, after all of our expenses, maybe 7, 8, 10% on their investment. All of a sudden, we have taken an uninvestable entrepreneur that happens to have in her hands the fate of a whole slew, a coastal octopus fishery, and we have upgraded sustainability. We have benefited, because they're probably going to get a better price, those local octopus gleaners, and we've made her business more sustainable, more lasting.
You're talking about Peter Drucker's idea that if you can measure it, you can manage it. It's not rocket science in that sense. But in terms of the investors you're talking to, do they also understand the other side of the coin, which is if they continue to invest in the industrial carbon intensive approaches that we have, that all those companies and all those investments are going to lose their value? And is that now a palpable reality for investors?
I think it's changing. I mean, I don't want to get into the whole ESG debate right now. I think it's great that we're trying to get more conscious about where our money goes, but it's a little disheartening to think about how hard we had to work to raise $23 million for a
Mhm.
little impact investment fund just to show that it is possible to invest in these poor coastal, fish processing groups and to make them more sustainable while, if your money's sitting in your retirement funding is sitting in the S&P 500, Vanguard fund right now, and you've been crushing it, over getting 15% a year over the last 5 or 7 years or whatever it's been. A lot of that money is still going into fossil fuel exploration and fossil fuel exploitation. And so it is really complicated to try to figure out how to get the money to really flow in the right places
We're driving at top speed into a car wreck and we can see it ahead, though. Do you point that out?
every day.
What do people say?
Depends on who they are. I mean, I don't I don't really spend any time debating climate deniers anymore. First of all, their numbers are dwindling, and second, that even the right-wing politicians, some of whom I've been able to privileged enough to have conversations with behind the scenes, know climate change is real.
Mhm.
It's not something they care enough about to try to educate their own constituents. It's too easy to stay with the status quo. But I think even that is dwindling. We in a lot of survey work that we have done with RARE with our work on shifting culture around climate solutions, we know the majority of Americans know climate change is happening. The majority of Americans know that it's human caused. The majority of Americans, if you take away the words climate change, are very interested in reducing food waste, having a healthier diet, installing rooftop solar, driving electric vehicles. I mean, those are not politicized really, and until someone comes along at a convention and says something dumb about taking away our hamburgers. The solutions to climate change are not political. In fact, they save people money long term. The net present value is usually very positive. So the conversations have to be, just a little calmer, a little more civil, and focused on what drives us, which is A, it's happening. People are changing.
Yeah.
People are saving a lot of money. I have solar panels and an electric vehicle, and I haven't paid for gas in 3 years. Does that appeal to you? I mean, you're whinging about gas prices. Guess what? There's an alternative. So we're making
So
progress.
how can an individual, one of our listeners, for example, make a difference today by supporting Rare or placing an investment, whether it's with the Life Fund or another impact fund? What's your advice if somebody wants to make a difference, particularly with their money?
I used to hate this question because 5 years ago I had no answer other than please vote and please donate to Rare. Right. So I'll start with those. Please vote. Especially if you're in the United States listening right now,
Please vote, folks. Please, please vote.
do it now. And if you're not signed up and if you don't know where you're voting, get online today and go figure it out. There's
Mhm.
nothing more important you can do. Okay, second, we would love you to go to rare.org and donate. Let's assume you're voting and you've already decided you want to be a rare donor. Then it gets really interesting. So, what can you do? It kind of depends on who you are. But if you want to address climate change, we know this to be a fact. If you are an American, there are 7 things you can do. Um, Maybe you can't afford all of them, but there's about 20% of Americans that can easily do all of these things. So that's 60 million people right there. You can adopt a plant-rich diet. Your spouse or your kids want you to already. Your doctor already has suggested it. If you're on any kind of drug for your heart or your blood, it's because you've been eating too much meat and cheese over the course of your life. So eat a little less red meat. That's a great thing to do, and it's good for you, and it's good for the planet. You can buy carbon offsets. If you think they're really political, just ask yourself, do I believe in planting trees? Are trees a good thing? And we know most people would agree with us. There's really not a lot wrong with planting a tree. Now, should it be a certain kind of tree in the right place? Should you water it after you plant it? I mean, I assume people are relatively intelligent. So buy an offset. What that really is a donation to somebody who's doing the right thing in some ecosystem. Contract green energy. If you own your home, figure out how to put solar panels on it. It will, depending on where you live, the payback can be a month to 10 years. In certain places, it's literally net neutral the day you do it. And you're going to save a lot of money over time. If you rent, well, check out a renewable energy credit or a consumer, a community solar package that you can potentially get involved with. Don't waste food. Everybody agrees that we should waste less food. 40% of food waste globally. Imagine how much goes into growing your food and how much biodiversity loss and how much deforestation goes into the cattle that then turn into the hamburger that you eat. Imagine then wasting, we all waste 40% of our food in our homes. So we can reduce that significantly. Electrify your vehicle. So make your next car electric. Yeah, hybrid's good too. That's a good transition technology, but go electric. You can charge it. You can charge it at home, especially if you have those solar panels. Fly once less. Flying is a big deal. Once less. Drive, take the train, go visit somebody closer by. Just once a year, one less flight makes a big difference. And then finally, get engaged socially. And this may be the most important point. Whatever you do, let other people know you're doing it. Because ultimately, you are way more influential than you think. People follow your lead, no matter who you are.
Brett, that's wise counsel. I hope everybody takes it to heart. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. But please remind us how you can donate to RARE.
You can go to rare.org, www.rare.org, and then there's little bells and whistles and buttons all over the place telling you how to do it.
Thanks so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mitch. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to my conversation with Rare.org founder Brett Jenks. You can learn more about Rare's nonprofit programs that support coastal fisheries restoration, smallhold farmers in the global south, and behavioral change programs that can reorient consumer priorities at Rare.org. And if you're interested in making an impactful investment, visit Brett's other project, the Malloy Fund, at malloyfund.com. Malloy Fund is all one word, no space, no dash, and Malloy is spelled M-E-L-O-Y. malloyfund.com. Brett's confidence that the world is turning toward more sustainable practices was also borne out for me during Climate Week in New York this year. There's genuine progress in sustainable practices being made at companies, but it remains for too many companies and countries just a comforting veneer laid over the continuing environmental degradation that they've been practicing for decades. By linking the benefits and profits that can be created through thoughtful regenerative activities by individuals, whether the farmers and fishing communities that Rare works with in the global south or US and European consumers who want to save money and the planet, by making those connections, we can build the critical interface where the conversation turns to action. And talking with and taking the time to build empathy for the communities already being devastated by climate change is the path to establishing nature-restoring incentives that tie together our actions at the store to the positive environmental outcomes that can be achieved globally. Rare's Fish Forever program, for instance, increased the biomass in coastal communities by 5 times by making that connection. And you can contribute right now by planning to take the 7 steps Brett described. Start by shifting your diet toward a plant-based protein and flying just 1 fewer times a year. Those 2 steps alone can take thousands of pounds of CO2 impact out of your annual lifestyle. Another action you can take is spreading the word about this podcast or any of the more than 490 interviews that we've done on sustainability in your ear. Please, folks, if you write a review on your favorite podcast platform, it will help your neighbors find us. You are the amplifiers that can spread more ideas to create less waste. Please tell your friends, your family, your coworkers, the people you meet on the street that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or whatever purveyor of podcast goodness they prefer. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.